Hey, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us for a very special episode of Entry Level Esports. This will be up on YouTube later as the episode for this week of Entry Level Esports, because I figured this week pretty much every question I'm going to get is going to be about this topic anyway. So why not address all of them on a longer live stream and be able to also get clarification questions from the chat? So I really appreciate any of you guys that are choosing to spend your New Year's Day with me. Happy New Year. It's already a very exciting year for the HGC. I am thrilled to already have so much content to cover and so much interesting news. So let's just jump into it. Let's break it down and talk a little bit about how the 2018 ownership rules actually function. So, in 2017, the way that ownership worked in the HGC was that every team, every spot in the HGC was owned by a majority of the players. So 3 players on each team essentially owned that spot. As long as 3 players from the original roster stayed together, that organization stayed in the HGC in that spot. So as long as Dignitas kept 3 of their members, Dignitas was still an organization. If 4 members of Dignitas had left after the midseason brawl, Dignitas would have been removed from the HGC and would no longer have their spot, and it would have been given to an open division team. Just like what happened with B-Step. The only reason it wasn't a ton of news when B-Step did it is because they were a free agent team. But if they had still been owned by Denial at the time, Denial would no longer be in the HGC. Blizzard decided to change that because that is a horrible thing for sponsors that want to invest in the HGC. And one of their goals for the 2018 season is to have every team sponsored by an organization, which is mildly ironic right this second because we're sitting on this live stream talking about 2 organizations leaving the scene. But it's kind of it's a weird situation that happened that we'll talk about in a second. So what Blizzard did to change this is they said, okay, starting in 2018, every spot in the HGC is now going to have to be owned by an organization. So the players still, at the end of 2017, owned the organization, and the rosters that were going to enter the 2018 season had to sign some sort of form. I have not seen the form, so I can't tell you what's on it, but they had to fill out a form stating that this organization owns the spot in the HGC. So if all 5 of us players leave the roster, this is the organization that has control of that spot and gets to decide the roster going forward. They're the ones that get all of the cheers. They're the ones that get the salaries and are responsible for paying the salaries out to the players, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the slight additional twist to that is that some organizations were grandfathered in. So rather than the players having to fill out a form, some organizations just got control of their spot outright. And these were, according to the Roll20 article and some conversations I've had with players and managers, these were all the teams that had a team and an established organization in Heroes before the 2017 season started. So that was all of the teams that you knew that had a roster before the qualifiers, essentially. So that was Dignitas, Fnatic, Liquid, Gale Force Esports, and Tempo Storm. The one additional kind of weird one is Team Freedom was also grandfathered in. And I did a little bit of research, and Team Freedom signed and released the statement for their signing of Grandmaster jackets on December 16th of 2016. So they were able to convince Blizzard that, hey, we were an organization before 2017, so technically we should be grandfathered in with all these other organizations. And so Blizzard agreed with that, and Team Freedom was also grandfathered in. So the players on Team Freedom did not have the same decision to make that the guys on Expert and Roll20 did. So if you're concerned, like Bags probably was all day today, about Team Freedom going away and his Team Freedom swag that he wears on every show now no longer being valid, Team Freedom is grandfathered in. They're not going anywhere unless they get relegated, and they're probably not going to. So that leaves us with the teams that were not grandfathered in: Roll20, Space Station, Expert, Tricked, and Heroes Hearth are all teams that going into the 2018 season had sponsors, but the players still owned their spot and had all rights and power to sign away their spot to their organization. And so, like we talked about on an episode of Troll and HGC way back in October, those teams were all faced with a choice. You can either sign away control of your spot to your sponsor, or you can work out a deal with your sponsor where you keep ownership and they still sponsor you, or you get rid of your sponsor and you try to market yourself and trade up to a better sponsor in the future rather than giving away control of your spot to the sponsor you have now. And as we know, Space Station and Tricked decided to give away their spot unless we're going to get announcements that they're gone later today, which to my knowledge is not going to happen. Heroes Hearth, when they qualified through the Crucible, their spot was also owned by the players. And I got confirmation this morning that Heroes Hearth, the organization, worked out a deal, renegotiated their contracts with the Heroes Hearth players when these new rules came out to give ownership to Heroes Hearth. So Heroes Hearth also now owns their spot. So as long as they don't get relegated next season, we will have Heroes Hearth in the HGC. You can buy your jerseys and swag for them without fear, as long as they don't get relegated. So, getting back to Roll20 and Expert, these two teams were faced with a really weird situation because they have pretty good sponsors. We've had no reports of any of these teams not paying their players, being difficult to deal with, being problematic for the players. So, by all accounts, they're good organizations, but they are very, very small organizations when it comes to esports. Roll20 had not been an esports organization before Heroes of the Storm at all. They weren't a thing. Roll20 Esports didn't exist until Team 8 signed with them. That's a very small esports organization. Expert is not an S tier or even an A tier esports organization. They are also very, very small. And so as a result, the players on Roll20 and Expert are thinking, we got to the top round at BlizzCon. We are very, very strong in our region. We expect to be very strong again this year. We are growing our brand. We're getting more followers. We're getting more Twitch views and subs. We are really blowing up, and we're expecting HGC 2018 to be even bigger than 2017 was. Do we really want to give away ownership of our spot to this small organization who's been great to us and we love working with? But do we want to give away that ownership, that control of our spot, which means we have to share all of the HGC cheer profits. We have to share a percentage of our prize money. We lose the ability to negotiate the value of this spot in the future. And honestly, for me, that's one of the biggest parts of this is not something that happens in other league-based esports. If you look at League of Legends, when the LCS was formed, this was already in place. Before the very first LCS split ever happened, every team had to give up control to an organization. Every team had an organization that was separate from the players or owned by one player before the season even started. So this was never even a consideration. Whereas in Heroes, the players already own the spot. They've seen all these other shady teams come in and not pay players and make weird roster changes and not communicate with their players or treat their players badly, make bad decisions in esports. They've seen all of these things happen. And even though they don't think that Roll20 is going to do those things necessarily, it's a risk. It's a huge risk to give away that control to an organization that you've only been a part of for 6 months. And as a result, we were put in the position that Roll20 and the players of Roll20 were faced with this season. Roll20 very reasonably wanted control of the spot. If anyone is upset at Roll20 for wanting control, you're wrong. It's completely reasonable for Roll20 to want control because every other organization has control of the spot. Like that's just what being in a league is. It protects your investment. It allows you to have equity that you can trade in later on if you want to get out of the scene. It gives you just more power and control to grow your brand. It gives you more control over the roster. It's just a better situation for the organization. So it makes perfect sense that Roll20 was not willing to go forward with the organization and with sponsoring these players if they didn't eventually get control of the spot. Likewise, it's completely reasonable for the players to not want to give that up. They're the best team in North America. They look like they're going to be the best team again. There's some Tempo fanboys that think differently than that. You're not correct, but you can think that. Roll20 is far and away the best roster going into 2018. That's just the case. They have the most value. They have the most equity in their brand name. Roll20 is a beloved brand in Heroes Esports right now. As a result, they don't have a clue what their spot is worth. There is no market right now for an HGC spot. We have no idea what the value of the number one team in HGC is right now because we haven't seen that team be signed. And so it's completely reasonable for the players of Roll20 to sit there and go, we've got this very small organization that we're a part of now that we're going to not only sign with for another year, but we're going to give complete control of this spot to, so that even if we decide we don't like this organization and we could get a better offer down the road, we have no opportunity to do that because we've given away control of the spot, so that if we left this organization, we would be the ones out of an HGC spot, not them. So they're going to play the market. They're going to find out what the value of a 2018 HGC spot for a top 3, possibly top 1 North American team is. We have no idea what that value is. I have some theories, but ultimately, that's where we're at right now, is that both Expert and Roll20 have no idea what the value of their team is, were not willing to give over control of their spot without testing the market, and the way that Blizzard timed these rule changes gave them no opportunity to do so at the end of the year last year because they were trying to prepare for BlizzCon. And as a result, they decided to take risk and gamble on being able to trade up to a better sponsor that they can eventually give control over to. Because that's another very important point that I think we all need to understand. No organization is going to come into Heroes unless they get control of that spot. At least no organization that's bigger than Roll20 or Expert. It's just not going to happen. Because why would you? There's already the risk of relegation, which is a huge fear for esports organizations. They've seen what happens in League of Legends. They've seen what happens in other organizations that have relegation. Relegation is terrifying to esports organizations. They do not want to mess with it. So you're going to tell them, not only do you have the risk of relegation, but you also are going to not get control of your roster. They're not going to mess with that. So eventually, every single organization that's in Heroes is going to own their spot in the HGC. There's still going to be the fear of relegation, but they're going to own that spot, and the players are going to work for them rather than vice versa. That's just what's going to happen hopefully by the end of 2018, as Blizzard's goal is. But when we see new organizations come in, we likely won't have to have this conversation because those organizations will have baked into their agreement with those players, you're going to give over control of your spot in the HGC to the organization. So that's a little bit about how ownership works as I understand it in the HGC going into 2018. There hasn't been a lot of detail given out from Blizzard on this, so it's possible that I could be wrong on some of this, or there could be more details coming in the future. Maddie B in the chat even brings up, isn't it a requirement by halfway through 2018 that you have an organization? I have not seen anything to that effect. It could be that that is a requirement. But even if that is a requirement, the guys that are now Team 12 could just make Team 12 Incorporated, have it be owned by Yitboss, and not sign with Team Solo Mid or Counter Logic Gaming or the Renegades or anything like that. That isn't really a thing. It's not like the Paladins League where every team had to sign with a WESA organization, which is why Renegades has a Paladins team in the first place. There's not going to be anything like that. There's going to be workarounds for that if the players don't want to give up their ownership of their spot. So that is the way that it works as I understand it. There could be more details, and hopefully there will be more details that come out soon, especially in the light of the confusion that's been stirred up by this news today. But that is a stated goal of the HGC in 2018. Their goal for 2018 is every team has a sponsor. What that looks like, what that means, what Blizzard is going to do to make that happen, I don't know. There's a lot of things they could do. There's a lot of things that are kind of sketchy that they could do that I don't expect them to do. But ultimately, what they can do and what we can do is just make the HGC attractive to investors. And one of the ways to do that is to create this new rule where the spot is not owned by the majority of the players, it's owned by the organization. That makes the HGC much more attractive to potential investors than it was in 2017. As a result, we should see not only more investor interest, but more reputable investor interest. So we hopefully won't see another playing duck situation or an Eventic situation happen again, because teams have more negotiating power right now, and you can just get more reputable investors coming into the scene now because of the way that it works right now. So that's where we're at with that. I'm going to probably on this particular live stream not dive into the whole is Roll20 as a roster stronger or not right now. I've talked about that a lot on other places. As a result, I think Roll20 is the best team in North America. Other people disagree. We'll talk about that another time. So to answer Yo Devil's question in the chat, does the sponsor have a word on kicking or acquiring a player now? The sponsor has 100% say in that right now. Space Station Gaming has control of Space Station Gaming's spot, which means they have control over Space Station's roster. There may be things in the contract where a majority of the players have to agree with the roster change or something, most likely not. But the sponsor has full say. They can get rid of their entire roster and bring in an open division team if they want to, because they own their spot. The way that Team 12 works right now is a little bit interesting, because as I understand it from the conversations that I've had, Team 12 is owned equally by 6 people. The 5 players that are on the starting roster and Yitboss. So each one of them owns 1/6 of Team 12, which means they all have equal say in roster changes. If there's a roster change, most likely what would happen is that the player who's removed would be bought out of their ownership in the team, and the new player that's brought in would get their ownership stake. Either that, or eventually it will all get consolidated to a couple of people. We'll have to wait and see. Their goal is obviously to get a sponsor and give that sponsor control of the spot, but they want to do it in the right way. Next question that's in the chat. This is Mr. Something. We've also just seen today that Expert is no longer affiliated. Is it similar? I talked with Thero a little bit this morning, and he said that essentially the players on Expert want to explore their options. As a result, because of the way that the ownership changes worked, they, just like Roll20, couldn't give Expert control of their spot and also seek other options. So they parted ways with Expert in order to play the field and see what their value is and try to get another sponsor. My understanding with Team 12 is that Yitboss and Justing are the guys kind of spearheading all of the ownership stuff and taking care of everything. So it's possible that they have a majority control. But I know that their goal was to be player focused and to divvy up cheer money and prize money and things like that equally between the players. So it may be that they had to declare a single owner, and that may be Justing. But I know that they are operating in a bit more egalitarian way in the way that they're going to distribute controlling interest in the team. So any other questions that you guys have, feel free to throw them into the chat. To reiterate from Morgoth's question, majority of players or existing players doesn't matter anymore. It mattered for staying in the 2018 HGC, which is why Michael Udall had to come back. He may have also wanted to come back, but he had to come back for GFE to keep their spot because Blizzard had not implemented the new rule, which they just put out a couple weeks ago, that I think a lot of people missed. But the way they've changed it now, the organization owns the spot and has full control over the roster. They can get rid of all 5 members if they want to and bring in 5 new players, and they will keep their spot. Most likely that is not going to happen. There's no reason for that to happen to pretty much any org, because every organization, every team has 1 or 2 really, really good players on it. But as a result, the organization owns it. So if Old Gods, for example, if Old Gods was owned by all 5 players could have equal ownership stake in the company Old Gods LLC Incorporated, etc. They may not. I have no idea how Old Gods are doing their ownership stuff. It likely is not that way because they kind of had to make some of these decisions before roster changes even happened. But they absolutely could do it that way because the organization is separate from the players now. So it's entirely possible. Like if Justing, for example, if Justing owns Team 12 right now, if Team 12 decided that Justing is a terrible tank player and they remove him, he'd still own their spot, which is kind of weird. So there's some interesting drama stuff that could happen down the road as a result of that. But the organization is separate from the players now. The rule that was in place that affected B-Step, that made Naventic disband, that made Michael Udall come back, that rule doesn't matter anymore. The rosters are locked in for the start of 2018. There will be no roster changes unless somebody gets hit by a car. There's not going to be roster changes. So that rule is irrelevant now. The majority rule does not apply anymore. The organization owns the spot. They have full control over the roster. Don't worry about that anymore. Do I expect Team 12 to sign with a sponsor? Eventually. They did not want to clarify, they did not want to give up ownership to Roll20 because they didn't have any idea what the market value of their spot is. If they go out there and they talk to 30 esports organizations and not a single one of them has any interest, they know what the value is of their spot, and they might sign with somebody that's equivalent to Space Station and give them control. But right now, they have no idea what the value of their spot is. It's entirely possible that the Renegades are willing to pay $10,000 for an HGC spot. $10,000 is pretty nice. We have no idea what Roll20 was offering. Roll20 might have just said, we're not interested in paying you anything for the spot. We want the spot. We don't know how those conversations went and what level they got to. What we do know is that the players of Roll20 were not interested in any deal with Roll20 that involved giving away ownership of their spot, which makes perfect sense to me because they have no idea what the value of that spot is. As a result, they're going to go play the field. I think it's going to be difficult for them to get an S-tier sponsor just because most of those organizations are in League of Legends or Dota. And from the research I did for another episode of Entry Level Esports that you can find on the Trolls GG YouTube page, plug, teams that have a Dota or League team don't have a Smite team, don't have a Haas team, don't get into MOBAs. They've already got their MOBA. So most likely we will see Team 12 sign with an organization that does not currently have a high-level MOBA team. What that organization is, I don't know. They don't have something lined up right this second. They're talking to a number of people. They might have some offers on the table. I would guess that it will be a little while before we see Expert or Team 12 get something. Vainglory is a very special exception because it's mobile. Mobile gaming is a very different space that organizations are super interested in exploring. And so they're in Vainglory because Vainglory, the company Super Evil Megacorp that makes Vainglory, really, really supports their esports scene. And it gives organizations like TSM and Cloud9 an entry point into learning about mobile gaming and building a brand there so that if mobile esports take off, they've already got a foothold there. Liquid is the exception to everything. Everything they do is a little bit weird. Don't know why that's the case. I don't know why they came back to Heroes when they did. I don't know why they've stayed. But they like MOBAs. I think that's what it is because they have a League spot, a Dota spot, and a Hero spot. I think they just like MOBAs a lot. Who knows? So Mamelish is trying to recap. Blizzard moved towards a spot ownership structure that's standard for esports, and that's what's making this a question. Yeah, basically because they didn't have this system from the start, it created a weird situation for the teams that were very, very good where they didn't know the value of their brand and they weren't signed by established grandfathered organizations. So they were put in a situation where they could explore their options, and so they chose to. So that's where we're at with that. Let's see about some of these questions from elsewhere. Shane W. Plum on Twitter asked a really interesting question for me. How will the new Crucible work with the team-owned slot setup? The Crucible is really potentially interesting because what I know from the most recent Crucible is Heroes Hearth did not own their spot when they qualified. The players owned it and had to give Heroes Hearth the spot. It may be that Blizzard changes that, but most open division teams are not going to be signed by a sponsor. If you think about it, the only one that was Heroes Hearth, which is an endemic website within Heroes of the Storm. I don't think we're going to see another open division team that is good enough to qualify sign with a Heroes of the Storm fan site. I don't think we're going to see the Town Hall Heroes team qualify for the HGC. So that situation specifically won't happen again. So most likely teams will enter the HGC through the Crucible without that as an option, and then we'll look for a sponsor to give ownership of that spot to, just like Heroes Hearth did, just like Space Station has done, just like Zealots is trying to do right now, all that good stuff. to the question, could Roll20 sign an open division team? Most likely what would happen is if Roll20 signed an open division team, in their contract with the open division team, they would put language that says if you qualify for the HGC, you give over control of your spot to us. And if you don't, there's a $10,000 fine or something, or a $500,000 fine. Whatever language they need to put into their contract to guarantee that they get ownership as soon as they qualify. Because I don't think there's any other way for Blizzard to put those rules in place, because so many open division teams are going to be free agent teams. So I don't think the Crucible is going to change all that much until we see every single HGC team signed. Because right now there's still a ton of free agent HGC teams that need sponsors before you even look at the open division teams. So that's where we're at with that. Feel free to ask any other questions that you've got in the chat. Other questions that we had, I've seen a lot of stuff complaining about the Team 12 name. They were Team 8. They're a little better now, so now they're Team 12. I don't see what the issue is with that. Every esports name is dumb, so it's not any more dumb than any other. We had Bob Ross Fan Club be the best team in Heroes of the Storm for a while. I don't think we can complain about Team 12. Team 12 is fine. It's also not going to be Team 12 for very long. It's going to be something esports as soon as they sign with a sponsor. A bunch of people were giving me suggestions that they should have renamed to stuff like Reroll, Natural 20, stuff like that. They're not a part of Roll20 anymore. They don't have any affiliation with the Dungeons and Dragons theme anymore. It makes no sense for them to keep something themed like that. So they went with Team 12 because it harkens back to their old legacy of what the team was, and it's a very fine thing because they're not looking to own the spot forever. They're looking for a sponsor. They're looking for someone to give ownership of that spot to whenever that person comes in and makes them an offer that makes sense, and once they understand the value of their spot. Because right now they don't have a clue what the value of their spot is. So that's where we're at on that. So if anybody else has any other questions, I think we've got pretty much everything. So at this point, hopefully anybody who's watching this should understand how 2018 ownership works, why the players of Roll20 made the decision that they made, why Roll20 didn't acquiesce to what they wanted, why the guys from Expert left their organization, why Team Freedom isn't affected that way. So that's where we're at. Mopsio says the ownership thingy is not attractive for teams, and it mostly convinces shady orgs to come. We have to make HGC attractive so big orgs will come back soon. What do you mean? Do you mean the new ownership thing is not attractive? When you say not attractive for teams, do you mean the teams like you guys that are unsponsored right now that have to give away ownership, or do you mean it's not attractive to the organizations you're talking to about trying to get sponsored? Because those are two very different things. And to clarify, like, this new rule sucks for the players. There's no other way around it. It absolutely sucks for the players. They went from having complete control and safety in their roster and being able to make all of the decisions that they wanted, getting to leave their organization if they wanted to, whenever they wanted to not having that anymore. That sucks. But for the stability of the league going forward, this is the way it had to be, I think, and this is the way it should have been from the beginning. If Blizzard had either waited to 2018 to start the HGC, or had required that that teams incorporate when they started the HGC, we wouldn't be in the situation we're in right now, because Roll20 would have gotten ownership of the spot as soon as they signed Team 8. Expert would have gotten this ownership of the spot. There would have been no grandfathering situation. None of this would have been a thing. As a result, they didn't choose to go that way, and so they put themselves in a situation where now every free agent team has a difficult choice to make, and that's just where we're at. It's going to be really awkward and tough for the next little while, but once every team has a sponsor, it's not going to be an issue anymore. Hopefully, Blizzard will do a better job of policing things. Hopefully, players will be smarter about the contracts that they sign. I'm available to read contracts. I've negotiated esports contracts before. I've found lots of shady stuff in esports contracts and negotiated it out before. So there are places that you can go to prevent your roster from getting signed by a shady organization. So Mopsio says, what I mean is that selling ownership of a spot for such a small money is not worth it. At some point, it's even easier to create your own organization based on Heroes roster. The ownership thing is attractive for big orgs, which are not interested in HOTS like G2 and Na'Vi, because there's no guaranteed LAN play for the team they sign. Relegation is also the point, but relegation is needed. So that's exactly right. Mopsy is 100% correct. Honestly, what I would advise teams like Zealots, not that they have asked me, but I would advise not signing anyone until after midseason brawl. Honestly, if you're a free agent organization right now, unless your players are freaking out that you're a free agent team or you need money to get health insurance, I would not sign with anyone until after the midseason brawl. Grow your brand, grow your Twitter following, grow your streams, prove that you're good. Make yourself more valuable, because like you say, right now, the teams that are free agents are basically in a really awkward situation where the organizations that they're willing to give control to aren't interested in Heroes of the Storm, and the teams that are interested in don't have the capital to make an offer that the players are willing to accept to give away control. And I think that's the thing that a lot of people aren't understanding in this conversation, is that giving away ownership of your spot is something you can only do one time. Once you do it, you never have that control again. And that sucks. And Heroes has had so many instances of crappy owners and shady owners not paying players, abusing players, treating them terribly, creating really uncomfortable situations for them. It's just, it's scary. It's scary to give away your ownership to an organization that is small, that an organization that's the size of an Eventic, a King of Blades, a Playing Ducks. These organizations that seemed great when the players signed with them, but at the time it wasn't as risky because they didn't have control of your roster. Now they have control of your roster. They can sell your organization to a Chinese company that just wants to blow up your roster and sign red canids from Latin America. Like, they can do whatever they want, and that's terrifying. So as a result, honestly, I think it makes the most sense to build your brand, and then at the midseason brawl, if you're a good organization, if you're a good team, then court some sponsors. If you're a bad team, you just need to get signed by whoever you can. You know, if you're on the verge of relegation, you just need to get signed, because you'll get a little bit more money before you get relegated out of the Crucible. And relegation is another part of this that sucks, but like Mopsio says, is necessary right now because we don't have 8 established organizations. You can't do a franchise model right now because we don't have 8 companies in the HGC. If every team was sponsored by a reasonable org, then maybe we could talk about a franchise model. But it took the LCS a long time to go to a franchise model and a revenue share model. I don't think we're going to see that in the HGC until probably like 2021. So yeah, to Sifnos's question, yeah, the teams that aren't sponsored just declared themselves the owner. They declared either a player or somebody else, somebody's brother. They incorporated their own company. They did something to where there is now an owner of their spot that is a separate entity from the majority of the players. So it's separate. You don't have to have a sponsor to have an organization own your spot. They're kind of two different things. They're the same thing for every team that now has a sponsor, but the teams that don't have a sponsor just made up an organization. Yeah, that's where we're at. So the number one thing in all of this is, if we want sponsors to come into the league, it just has to be more attractive. And ultimately, that is the responsibility of the fans. If you're a fan of the HGC, you need to watch the HGC. You need to follow players on Twitter. You need to respond to things on Reddit. You need to buy merch. If you want the HGC to grow, you need to make the HGC attractive by supporting the HGC. Likewise, the players have a responsibility to do the same thing. The players have a responsibility to stream. The players have a responsibility to be interesting on Twitter. The players have a responsibility to play well and be interesting personalities in the scene. Blizzard has a responsibility to sell the HGC more attractively to Heroes fans. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later this week in an article about how the game is kind of fighting itself in terms of esports, which kind of every Blizzard game is, but that's a topic for another day. But ultimately, the game itself being good or not doesn't matter. What matters is the metrics. If the metrics are good, esports organizations are going to invest. If the metrics suck, esports organizations aren't going to invest. That's really what it comes down to. So if we make the metrics good, these teams are going to be able to negotiate with better sponsors. Or they can keep their own organization. You know, every really big esports organization right now started out as something that the players did together. Team Solo Mid and Counter Logic Gaming were started by one player taking their prize money, growing a brand, and making their own company. Tempo Storm was started by a Hearthstone player named Reynad, who won a bunch of tournaments, got really popular on Twitch, and used all of that money to create a company. You can do the same thing. It's a lot harder in Heroes because there's not as much money as there is in those other games. But if you get the right people around you, if you brand yourself the right way, if you stream a lot and are popular, if you tweet well, you can grow your brand into a brand that people are willing to invest in. And then you don't have to give away control to another sponsor, or you make yourself more attractive to a decent sponsor. And just win. You know, winning helps that a lot. Teams don't want to invest in organizations that aren't winning, because winning is the number one marker of a popular team. It's a lot harder to be popular if you're not winning. Which is why I think Roll20 is going to be really interesting, because the owners of Roll20 are really passionate about Heroes. They just like the game. So it's entirely possible that they will want to look at another team down the road, or even reopen talks with a team down the road. I don't know that will happen, but it's entirely possible that we could see the Old Gods roster be part of Roll20 after the midseason brawl. We just don't know yet. There's no way to know until we get into the season. We see how the teams perform. We see how the numbers are for the HGC, because they were not amazing last season, so the numbers need to get a lot better. And honestly, I think that's what a lot of sponsors are looking at right now, is they're kind of waiting and seeing, because one, they have no idea what this roster is going to do in the next season. You know, if you sign old gods, you have no idea if they're going to be the third best team or the eighth best team, and they could get relegated. So why would you sign them now? It makes way more sense as an organization to wait and see where they end up. Matty B, I don't think sponsors help boost viewership that much. Most esports viewers watch the game that they watch and don't really watch a ton of the other games for their team. Like TSM fans watch TSM play Counter-Strike, or they watch TSM play Vainglory, or they watch TSM play League of Legends. They don't really cross over. It's a very small percent that crossover. So getting Immortals to sign Team 12 isn't going to suddenly bring all of their Overwatch League fans over into Heroes of the Storm. What's going to make Heroes of the Storm a more popular esport is more Heroes of the Storm players watching the esport. Any scenario, Roll20 and Team 12 reunite. It's entirely possible. We don't know how mad they are at each other. If they ended things on good terms, there's no rule saying they couldn't. I don't know anything one way or the other to comment on that. It really just depends on how that relationship is and stays going forward. And it would also require Team 12 to not be able to attract a better offer, which we don't know. Yeah, I mean, I think it's tough to read into that comment by the statement by Roll20 too much, because they're bummed. Like, both the players and the organization had every intention of being Roll20 going into the 2018 season. The only reason that any of this happened is because Blizzard changed the rules and forced these teams to change things. So they were all on good terms until this ownership change happened. And as far as I understand it, and from reading that conversation, there's no reason to say that anything else about their relationship was negative. Mopsia says, also another point is that big organizations do not want having a team which is a wild card even for free. Yeah, so the big orgs, like, the players want a salary, but even if players were willing to sign with an organization and not collect a salary from it, they have no idea if Heroes is even worth the time and energy to pay social media staff, to get jerseys made. They still could be operating at a loss even if they don't pay salaries. And Heroes is still such an unknown, and the teams are such an unknown. Like, we inform our opinion of an organization based on how that organization is in the game that we follow. Like, if you are, let's say SK Gaming had a Heroes of the Storm team, and that Heroes of the Storm team was consistently 7th place, if you only watched Heroes of the Storm, you would think that SK Gaming is a bad organization. And so if you followed another game, you would be like, oh, SK, they suck. So it actually can hurt an organization to get into a new sport, even if they don't pay salaries. Dubber Ducky asks, Vainglory has like 500 viewers. Why do orgs pick that game over HOTS? I talked about this on another episode of Entry Level Esports a bit. It's because, excuse me, I'm going to cough. So teams get into Vainglory for two reasons. One, the organization that runs Vainglory, Super Evil Megacorp, is pouring money into their esports scene in terms of prize money and just support for the organization. So it's a very easy thing to invest in. And it's mobile. It's the only very, very serious mobile esport right now. It's a completely new space that organizations like TSM and Cloud9 are investigating through Vainglory. They're learning about, okay, how do people watch this? How does it do on Twitch? How is the community around it? How are the productions for the tournaments? They're learning about how mobile gaming in esports works, because potentially 5-10 years from now, mobile esports could be a very, very big thing. And so they're learning about all of that through Vainglory as kind of that is their risk that they're taking. Rather than take a risk on a small game like Battle Right or Heroes of the Storm, they're taking their risk on mobile as a platform. Jerry Smith 750 says, was dumb to change ownership to orgs. It absolutely was not dumb. It was the correct decision for Blizzard to make, because the other way around is not attractive to sponsors. Big sponsors are never going to come into Heroes with the viewership where it is. If they have the fear of relegation, they don't have control over their roster. If they want to get rid of 3 players, they lose their spot. All of that stuff makes it so that it's impossible for organizations to really seriously invest in Heroes because it's such a risky investment. Changing that ownership makes it so that it is a much safer investment. It's still risky because relegation exists, but if you sign Team 12, most likely they're not going to get relegated, and now you have control over the roster, over the branding, over getting rid of players if you need to, over rebuilding. Your investment is much safer in this model than it is in the old model. So it's kind of it's better for the stability of the league long term, but it sucks for the players and it sucks for the teams. The orgs are not dropping out. The players did not sign with the orgs. If it was up to Roll20 and Expert, I don't know for Expert 100%, but if it was up to Roll20, they would still be an organization. But the players didn't want to give up that ownership of the spot, so they didn't sign with Roll20 going forward. We didn't see that happen with Space Station, Tricked, Heroes Hearth, those organizations. All the other organizations stayed. And even more interestingly, the grandfathered organizations stayed. We did not see Dignitas, Fnatic, Liquid, Gale Force, Tempo, or Freedom leave the scene. All of those teams are committed for another year. And those are huge esports organizations. I mean, Fnatic in their Welcome to 2018 tweet used a picture of Quackmix. They are invested in Heroes. They like their Heroes team. Their Heroes team also happens to win a lot, so that helps. But those organizations are all committed to staying in Heroes after having been grandfathered in. So organizations that got ownership, every single one of them stayed. Mopsio might be able to comment more on Team Wish, but Wish was a brand new organization that had not been in esports before, and so they partnered with Zealots through potentially BlizzCon, and then again these ownership rules came up and forced Wish and Zealots to reassess that relationship going into 2018. And if Mopsio wants to comment a little bit more on that, he can. Otherwise, I would just say it just didn't make sense with the new ownership changes for that relationship to continue. It's the exact same thing. Zealots were a really promising organization that now with the ownership changes made it tough for the players to sign with Wish or for Wish to have the capital to make the investment worth the players giving over their ownership. It's the same thing as Roll20, as Expert, as all these organizations. And again, they were brand new in esports. They didn't really know, from talking with their representative, they didn't really fully know what they were getting into with esports. So they had an opportunity to vacate the spot, and they did. I don't think that's necessarily a bad sign for Heroes, as it would be. Like, if Dignitas, Fnatic, and Tempo had left this year, that would be a really bad sign. So yeah, Mopsio says, our agreement with Team Wish had gone over with ending 2017. We made some plans together, but they decided not to invest in esports for 2018, but focus on sponsoring the Lakers basketball team. So basically, Wish made a deal with Zealots to sponsor them for the rest of 2017, and then when they renegotiated contracts for 2018, Wish decided to back out of esports because they learned that esports just wasn't for them at this time. They may come back, we don't know, but right now they just want to focus on other things as an organization, which is entirely reasonable. They weren't an esports organization. They weren't reliant on esports for their income. So, yeah, and however you say your name, Zatoichi8, sorry, makes a really good point. We just don't know what the value of an HGC spot is right now. That's one of the things that these organizations are going to learn over the next 6 months leading into the midseason brawl, is how much are they worth? And once they learn what they're worth, then we'll see them sign with organizations. They might sign with weaker organizations. They might keep their own brand for a while. Some of them might get signed by really good organizations if the numbers for the HGC are really good. Excuse me. But right now, we just don't know what the market is for a Heroes team. So these organizations are going to have to learn what the market is and then make decisions accordingly. Ghost Dunk asks, any chance Cloud9 will come back? No. I would be willing to put money on Cloud9 never coming back to Heroes. They have an Overwatch League spot. They have a really, really great League of Legends team. They've had some success in Dota. They've been kind of reducing over the last few years. So I don't think that we will see Cloud9 come back to Heroes probably ever. If there's some sort of partnership that happens with the Overwatch League, or if Heroes explodes in the next couple years. I mean, if Heroes is an amazing investment and every organization is going to try and get a spot, it's just never – I don't think Heroes is ever going to be a better investment than League and Dota, and they've already done that. So why invest in another MOBA that's smaller when you can diversify into other games and tap into a completely different market with different merchandising opportunities, different advertising opportunities? Like, right now, Heroes is just a less attractive League or Dota because there's fewer lands, there's less stability, there's not huge stars that aren't already signed into the biggest teams. It's not attractive for a Cloud9 level of organization with the other investment decisions they made. Like, they put $20 million into getting an Overwatch League spot. They don't have money to sign anybody at this point. MNRC, did T12 just not want to give up ownership of their spot, or do you think that the two parties just couldn't agree on giving ownership due to job security, salaries, financial? My theory is that there was no scenario where T12 was going to give away ownership, and that there was no scenario where Roll20 was going to continue sponsoring them if their agreement did not include giving over ownership at some point or in some structure, which makes perfect sense from both sides. I don't think either side is wrong in their opinion there. I don't think either side is acting evil or greedy or wicked or whatever other words you want to say. I think it makes perfect sense from both sides. I think the players on Team 12 needed to learn what the market was for their team, and Roll20 wanted to own the spot because, of course, they did, and that was, They never even made it to discussing numbers, so it seems like the sticking point was ownership, and the players were not even remotely willing to give up ownership in any capacity, or at least in any capacity that Roll20 offered, and so that's kind of where they got stuck. Outside of that, by all accounts, they were pretty happy with Roll20. Most likely, we would have seen Roll20 be in the 2018 HGC if the rule had not changed. The rule changed, so they're exploring their options, and they parted ways on at least agreeable terms, as I understand it. So we are at an hour. Liquid, I don't know how much longer you want to stick around here listening to me talk for. So if anybody else has some significant pressing questions, if you just jumped in, I'm sure this will be this is going to be on YouTube later this week, hopefully soon, as this week's episode of Entry Level Esports. So go to YouTube and subscribe to Trolls GG on YouTube, and you will be able to know when this pops up, or you can follow me at Trent_Esports or at TrollsGG, and we will all tweet out when the episode goes live. At the very, very start of this, we talked about why Team Freedom isn't in the same situation as these other teams, why Heroes Hearth isn't in the same situation as these other teams, how the 2018 ownership rules even function. So if you have questions about all of that, or you joined the stream late, keep an eye out for the VOD on YouTube, and it will be able to break all of that down for you. And to answer M. Nurse's question one more time, any sponsor is going to want ownership. So Team 12 eventually is going to give away ownership. They are looking for someone to take ownership away from them. They just need it to be someone that gives them the value of their spot. Robin Bloxley, would Blizz step in and force 12 to give up ownership or set a deadline? I don't think so. It would be weird for them to do so unless they partnered. So to give a little bit of background on that, can we still hear me? Neat. Well, then stare at my face. Look at the fight stick over in the corner. It's a really pretty fight stick, and I'm very excited about it. So to give you some background, the way that the Paladins professional league works is that Hi-Rez, who makes Paladins, partnered with the World Esports Association, which has teams like Fnatic, Renegades, Ninjas in Pajamas, Splice. All of these teams are part of the World Esports Association, and the two organizations partnered together to create the Paladins Pro League. And so, as a requirement, every team that qualified for the Paladins Pro League had to sign with a WESA organization in order to get a spot. So, every team in the Paladins Pro League is owned by an organization that is a part of the World Esports Association. If Blizzard was dead set on every team having a named title sponsor organization, what they could do is do what League of Legends is doing right now, which is a franchise model. So what League of Legends did is they took back ownership of every single spot and said, none of y'all have ownership of your spot right now. You still have your contracts with your players to represent your name, but we are going to evaluate every organization that's in our league, and we're going to get rid of some of you, and we're going to bring in some new stuff. So like Immortals doesn't have a League of Legends team anymore because Riot took that ownership away from them and gave it to another team, let's say 100 Thieves. So 100 Thieves has Immortals spot now because they made a better offer to Riot for that spot. So what Blizzard could do, in theory, is they could say, okay, we're going to create a new HGC, and every esports organization in the world that wants in on this, send us a packet saying why you deserve a spot, and then we are going to pick the 8 that get a spot, and then those 8 organizations will then go out and make their rosters. So effectively what they would do is blow up every single roster and then rebuild those rosters and require every roster to be a part of a organization, which is basically how like the NFL works. If you think about the National Football League, every player that enters the NFL does so through the draft. So all of the players just exist in this pool, and then the organizations, the Patriots, the Steelers, pick out the players that they want for that organization. Esports doesn't work that way because everything is open at the start and the teams are already established before they come into the league. And so esports kind of works kind of weird. But Blizzard ultimately owns the HGC, so they could decide, now we're going to do it differently because we own everything, and we're going to get rid of all these rosters and start a new thing where every single team has to have a title sponsor. I don't see that happening, but it is a thing that could happen legally. Specifically, would they step in and say, okay, Team 12, you have to sign with someone that's not you guys? Probably not, because there's no reason for them to. It's kind of a bad look for the best team in your league to not be sponsored and have a weird crying cat as their logo. But the Unicorns of Love have been a thing in League of Legends for a while, and are pretty popular. So, like I said, every esports name is dumb, and who cares if you're winning? So, frankly, I'd just love to see the Unicorns of Love come into Heroes. I think that would be perfect because we have a unicorn mount. It'd be perfect. They could all ride unicorns and wear unicorn hats. If you haven't watched Unicorns of Love, go YouTube some stuff. They wear unicorn hats. It's amazing. So that is a weird hypothetical that could be entirely taken out of context and clipped out of this to make everybody really scared. So please don't do that, because it's probably not going to happen. I hope that everyone who tuned in has a little bit more of an understanding of how the ownership works. If you're watching this on YouTube, please share it with anyone that you see doesn't understand how ownership works. Blizzard, if I said anything wrong, please correct me. But this is all based on me talking to players and organizations. So I have a pretty reasonable understanding of being correct on most of it. Be sure, if you missed out, to subscribe to Trolls GG on YouTube, or to follow me at Trent_Esports for when the VOD goes live on YouTube to catch up on all that good stuff. And other than that, I will see you guys later, and we will talk about something else on the next Entry Level Esports.